I'm excited to kick off our afternoon session, looking at whether or not, and I shouldn't say whether or not, whether, I'm sure it can, how nonprofit local news can save democracy. I'm thrilled to have our moderator, Joe Mathews, joining us, and Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro and Sewell Chan. Take it away, Joe.
Hi, thanks very much. You can hear me all right? Excellent. I'm Joe Mathews. I wear a lot of hats. I'm a journalist in Los Angeles, and I want to thank Matt Leininger, a friend and occasional collaborator, for inviting me here. I work as a California columnist, syndicated columnist, and democracy editor at a media nonprofit in LA called Zocalo Public Square, which is affiliated with Arizona State University. I'm a Future of Democracy Fellow at the Berggruen Institute, and I do a lot of democracy work around the world, a global forum, and a new publication. I think I'm now supposed to say planetary, one funder insists. Planetary publication devoted to local democracy, everyday people governing themselves. This is a great conversation. We're going to talk about some green shoots in a tough picture, and sort of bridging a lot of gaps out there in the media and civic space and communities all over this country. I'm supposed to, according to the show, ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. So I'll first turn to Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro.
Great, and I think this is on. Great. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I'm Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro. I am the CEO and co-founder of the National Trust for Local News. We are a nonprofit national newspaper operating company. So we are buying small papers in communities around the country to not just help them keep from going out of business, but also to really encourage a revitalization of small-scale community news. And I can talk more about what that means as this discussion evolves. But we have 24 newspapers in the state of Colorado. We launched in 2021 with that first acquisition. And over the summer, we purchased 22 titles in the state of Maine, so 5 dailies and 17 weeklies. And we have active projects in Georgia and in Texas, and we've heard from publishers in all 50 states. So we have what I like to think of as a very grassroots, kind of up close seat to local democracy and the relationship between local news and local civic engagement, which I'm happy to talk more about. So that's me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sewell Chan. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune. We're a 14-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization based in the state capital of Austin, really focusing at the state level. And one of the distinctions I want to make is between state and local, because they are different. And we're essentially covering kind of a nation state of 30 million people. I always joke we've got 30 reporters for 30 million people. We could use more. We were founded in 2009, and so we're one of the older state-focused nonprofit newsrooms. We work closely, however, and constantly are sharing knowledge and information with many other newsrooms that have emerged in state capitals to focus on this vital level of government. So, folks from Mississippi Today, Mountain State Spotlight, Cal Matters, we could talk about the many different examples. And I came to the world of nonprofit journalism after more than 20 years in kind of commercial mainstream media, including stints at the New York Times and at the LA Times. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Sewell. Can we start by talking about what the picture is, but with a focus to what is the picture of local news media in the country? There's you see figures that we've lost. 1 in 5 Americans are at risk of losing their local media. There's over 200 counties that don't have anything. But what is sort of the what are we missing? What is the gap between where we are and where you'd want a healthy, democratic, civically engaged country to be?
Yeah, so that's such a great question, and because the kind of traditional newspaper-based media ecosystem in this country has severely atrophied, and we've seen all kinds of interesting experiments, nonprofit and otherwise, in local news growing up. I would say it's a really vibrant picture of lots of different kinds of approaches to providing local, hyperlocal, local, state level, metro level news and information. So, one thing that has struck me in traveling around the country and talking to newspaper publishers and talking to nonprofit funders of journalism is that every state in our country is different. So Texas, has the wonderful privilege of being anchored at the state level by the Texas Tribune and the fabulous State House and statewide coverage that you do. Lots of states are copying the Texas Tribune and really, leaning into that kind of statewide coverage of like what our state house is doing and what are the public policy issues affecting states. And then kind of further down the scale, it really varies. Where we are in Colorado, we've been able to keep alive county and kind of town level suburban newsrooms that are able to serve communities around, issues like local housing development, high school sports, planning commissions, and then, with Cam and others in this room, there are towns around this country, like where we live in Lexington, Massachusetts, that have started their own, 1 and 2 person startup nonprofit newsrooms, and that's even a different model of local news, providing local news. So it's really, I would say, it's a vibrant and experimental time, and it looks very different depending on where you live.
I agree with Elizabeth, and I'd just quickly add, look, I don't believe there was a golden age of news in America or local news. We can talk about that. Many communities were left out, not covered, et cetera, et cetera. So the reasons why people may not trust news in general or even their local news providers, there are many. So I want to start by acknowledging that. And I also want to say that local newspapers used to do things, they were essentially a public sphere in when responsibly owned and managed. They brought together high school sports results, local obituaries of local business leaders, advertisements that were relevant to the community, notices of community meetings, and of course covering all manner of school board, water board, utility, and council meetings that now go uncovered in so much of America. One reason I was excited to come to this conference is I don't believe, to be honest, that the nonprofit news world and the journalism protection world, that there's enough overlap. And frankly, I'm a deep believer that at least in America, we have to see journalism as a pro-democratic institution. That doesn't mean that we're trying to specify any partisan outcomes or even necessarily endorse specific policies, but it does mean that we have to understand that journalism is a public good, especially at the local level. Digital economies all emphasize scale, which is why when you look at those publications like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that have managed to achieve digital takeoff, it's because they really appeal to national and global audiences. They're great institutions. I've worked for both. But that's not what state, local, regional news is about. And that public good is what's at risk of going away. And the disappearance of local news is correlated with higher levels of disengagement, lower voter turnout, higher polarization, more misinformation, and even more corruption. A widely cited study talks about how tax rates have gone up in places where there's no more local news because there isn't that watchdog or accountability function anymore. Not to mention the contribution to isolation and loneliness that I think happens when there's less and less reliable information. It's fine to use your Nextdoor app or your local block Facebook group, nothing wrong with that. But when that's the only source of information and it's not necessarily verified or checked out, then we've got some problems.
Okay. I want to get more into the role that local news media can play. But first, I want to, so the audience, in which may not be that familiar with this, understands kind of where we're at. So you see different numbers and different reports, but we've gone from, by one counting, 8,800, sort of local news to 6,000 maybe. It's 2,200, 2,800. That's one, so there's that loss. Dailies have become weeklies. And then filling the gap, the three things I see most talked about and tracked and the state of news media reports and by the folks at Northwestern Medill is that we talk about nonprofits. Sewell's the nonprofit. I'm in a nonprofit that's not about news, it's about context, but ethnic media. And then to a great extent, you hear a lot of public radio, and there are both stations and sites sort of filling gaps. So then there's the outlet number, and then there's like a money number.
There's also local TV, which in many communities is still doing a job covering communities.
TV. Yeah. So, I mean, just looking at the papers and websites, 20 years ago, advertising and circulation revenue in this country for them was $50 billion. Now it's 10, okay? So that's 40 billion gone, and our friends at the MacArthur Foundation who want to do a lot more in this, we think of they're so rich, they only have 8.2 billion. So even if they put in all of this, they couldn't fill that gap. So how do we bridge? How does that gap get bridged? What does it look like to rebuild or to? I mean, I'm not sure what the right word is. To renovate, to start anew. What does it take to get us to a place where every local community in this massive country of 330 million people has a sort of a local media entity of some kind that it needs?
Well, can I start, and then I'd love
Sure,
to ask you.
Yeah.
Just for some context, as many of you know, MacArthur, Knight, some other foundations are putting together a $500 million pooled fund to help, jumpstart local news initiatives in America. It is widely appreciated. It's causing a lot of excitement in the field, some anxiety. But also, to put it in context, by some estimates, we would need $1.5 to $1.7 billion a year to make up for the local news that's been lost throughout America. So absolutely, this $500 million investment is so much needed, but we need to know a lot more. Public media is also a big part of the picture, right? But a lot of people think public media, so many people are mistaken. They think public radio is like funded by NPR. In fact, public radio funds NPR. The second misconception is they think, public media, that must mean giant federal subsidies to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which provides, on average, about 2 to 4% of public media budgets, right? And then there's the local television picture. There's still a lot of network-owned and operated or locally owned stations that are trying actually to do some good work, and I think that should be recognized. Rebecca Blumenstein at NBC News is trying to use those local stations and really kind of, maximize their impact. But that said, I think the future, I think personally we're in all of the above moment. I don't think it's about ownership structure, although obviously I don't think hedge funds are part of the solution. But I think supporting independent and locally controlled, locally staffed local news is the most important thing. There are still papers like the Seattle Times, Minneapolis Star Tribune, Boston Globe that have in a way been revived or at least maintained under local ownership. I think the key is local because there's accountability when it's actually your community. If you're a hedge fund based in New York controlling hundreds of newspapers around the country, believe me, they're not interested in accountability. What I'm interested in about Elizabeth's model so much is that, frankly, a lot of people in our field were like, newspapers are dead. There's no way they can be revived. They're over. Everything has to be burnt down and started anew. I personally don't believe that's the case at all. And I'd love to hear about how you got interested in preserving and maintaining local newspapers, recognizing they're still very important.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, you mentioned the statistics about newspapers closing, and, our read of the research is that there's about 4,100 independently owned newspapers still alive in this country. So our mission is let's be sure that those 4,100 are 4,100 next year and the year after and the year after. The newspaper reporters still generate the majority of enterprise reporting in this country. So, you think
original
reporting. So those reporters who are in those newspapers are a really critical civic asset at all levels. So, I entered this conversation saying we just at a baseline, we got to make sure that we don't lose that foundation. Part of what we're trying to achieve in our model, to your point about local ownership and control, the hedge funds and the Gannett's and the McClatchys of the world, from a business perspective, I think actually have been quite brilliant, because what they've been able to do is realize really important business economies of scale across a whole bunch of news outlets. So you can have one single paper purchaser. You can have one single purchaser of benefits. You can have one single payroll system. system, one single HR system. Part of why we're seeing on the business side a lot of these smaller newspapers go under is that just becomes really, really expensive when you have a declining advertising and subscriber base, and you can't invest in innovation, and you can't pay your reporters more, and you can't really do much of anything other than tread water at best. So the intervention that we are making is to say, how can we build a newspaper company nonprofit newspaper company that can benefit from some of those economies of scale that our, corporate media friends have really figured out, at the same time that we're really honoring local participation and local control. And so what that's meant for the National Trust in terms of governance is that we are kind of like, the YMCA or the Boys and Girls Club or Planned Parenthood, where the National Trust itself, we have our board and our staff, but we are building local boards in the states that we operate. And those local boards are really important because ultimately it's people who are closest to those communities who understand what are the issues that matter, what does a vibrant civic life look like in this state. That's not anything that we at a national level can or should be having any kind of influence on. Wow. So, that's what we are trying to do. That's the intervention we're making into the newspaper space. A lot of time people say to me well, what about digital startups, or what about, public radio? And I'm sure there's all kinds of interesting things we can do in 20 and 30 years, but for right now, we're focused on those 4,100 independent, small-scale newspapers that I think are a really important civic asset that we have to handle.
And the key thing is that any money you make from these local papers gets plowed back into that community.
That's right. So
it's not stock buybacks, or
it's not stock buybacks. It's not public shareholders. So I think the other important innovation for us in the context of a nonprofit news conversation is that we're nonprofit owners, but we are endeavoring to run our subsidiaries as businesses. So they still have subscribers, they still have advertisers, they still have paywalls. We can raise philanthropy to buy papers, and we can raise philanthropy to invest, but we are not, and this is really important for our funders, we're not saying we're buying papers and, oh, by the way, you're going to have to write us $1 million check every year so that we can keep them alive. And this is all, this is an innovation. So like many innovations, as I'm sure you all know, I'm sure some parts will continue to succeed and other parts we will, learn from. But so far it seems to be working.
What's the smallest newspaper in the smallest community you own?
So I was just looking at this. So we own the Bethel Citizen in Bethel, Maine. And Bethel, Maine has, I think as of the 2020 census, has 2,500 people. So we can get pretty small pretty fast. So the other power of this model, and this is what lots of corporate media has figured out, is that if you have some papers in bigger communities and some papers in smaller communities, then you can kind of make it all even out. Whereas if you were going to try to start from scratch a nonprofit or a commercial newsroom in a town of 2,500, would be very important for the civic life of that community. Not at all clear how you would actually build that as a business.
Is the Bethel paper, how many people does it have? Are they professionals, paid staff?
Yeah, so this is the other kind of interesting piece about how we can support newsrooms. So in a lot of these paper chains that have grown up over time, owned by families, you can have a single newsroom and a single editorial structure that then has a reporter for this community, a reporter for that community. So you're also not trying to have multiple reporters and multiple editors covering a town of 2,500. You can have one dedicated person, and then you can have other editors and other reporters who can contribute. So for example, we own the paper in Lewiston, Maine. And the Lewiston newsroom has 5 reporters and 1 editor. And when the terrible, tragic mass shooting unfolded in October, those 5 reporters and editors were on the ground, but then the other 140 reporters that we had across the state were able to mobilize to really cover this, not just as facts about what happened, but also trying to really push on what exactly was the timeline, and what were the policies that led to us, and which communities have been affected, and and what are some measures to address it. So there's so at that kind of scale, you can really cover an issue not just with one reporter, but have many to support.
Thank you. So what can we expect of the nonprofit model to cover? I mean, it's growing. There's a lot of excitement about it, including amongst professional journalists. But you look at where the stuff is, and it's usually in fairly bigger places that have other media options, whether it's in a smaller rural place or in even a particular neighborhood or community, a section of a city. Less likely to see the nonprofit. What's reality? Where could we get to realistically?
A few observations, and one reason why what Elizabeth is doing is so important, and also a related organization but separate called American Journalism Project, which is trying to stand up nonprofit newsrooms in different parts of America where there's less local news. Joe's critique is valid. If you look at where nonprofit newsrooms have been created, they tend to be created in places that are not yet complete news deserts. Because by the time a place has gotten to be a complete news desert, both in terms of scale and local resources, there's big problems there. And that's why, in a way, Elizabeth is like preventing places from becoming news deserts. What we're trying to do at the Tribune is, we say a few things. First of all, nonprofit is a tax status. It is not a business model. You've still got to have revenue coming in the door. Even if half that revenue is from philanthropic sources, foundations, endowments, major gifts. But for us, at least, the other half does include earned revenue, corporate sponsorships, everything disclosed, of course. Every person who gives us money in any form is disclosed. Our newsletters, people can sponsor our live events, and we have 99% of our events are free, but we have an annual ideas festival called Texas Tribune Festival. That's about 10% of our budget. So there's that revenue component. And the second part is, look, we're not local or we're certainly not hyper-local. But today we have journalists in 9 cities across Texas, including Odessa in the Permian Basin, Lubbock in West Texas, and Lufkin in East Texas, and we're about to put some in the Rio Grande Valley. Wow. But we're not trying to pretend to cover them locally. We're not going to do like a local shooting or something. What we're doing is like the impact of state policies made in Austin and how they're experienced or felt hundreds of miles away, because Texas, after all, is a gigantic state. And so there's that mismatch. Not only is there urban-rural divide, but there's also even like a state capital versus rest of the state divide in so many states. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do to bridge it by doing more local events, more live journalism. But for sure, we need more local newsrooms to exist throughout the state. The only thing I'd say about nonprofits is that, on one hand, let 100 flowers bloom, a lot have bloomed. What I worry about right now is sustainability. I think the rate of nonprofit newsroom creation has outpaced the actual level of funding needed. And I also think, to be honest, that we don't have a very clear, and this is why this conference is so important, I think both pro-democracy people sometimes can be ambivalent about news and journalism for reasons we can get into. Yeah. And sometimes news and journalists can get, allergic to the idea of supporting democracy. Right? Journalists, to the extent that we have a bias, it's a bigger conversation, but I would say we have biases toward negativity. Sometimes biases toward conflict or scandal. Hello.
Well, I'd like to argue that point.
And but I actually think it's a more subtle bias. It's not like, we favor Democrats always and everywhere. That's just not the case. But it's more like, is there a more communitarian model of journalism that really focuses on a community's assets, its strengths, and potential solutions to major policy challenges? And, I'm of mixed minds about that debate, to be honest, because I'm in that debate, right? A lot of local news publications, their support is because they are boosters for their community. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It just shouldn't be the only thing you're doing. But on the other side of the coin, a lot of journalists, to be honest, we consider the most prestigious work to be these lengthy investigative series that point to misconduct and wrongdoing. All of it's important. I'm on the board of the Pulitzer Prizes. That is really, really important work. But it alone isn't enough if we're trying to sustain democracy, because writing about everything that's effed up is not, frankly, the entire picture. And that's a conversation that I think the democracy community and the journalism communities need to have more.
So let's talk. Go ahead. Please.
Yeah, I love that point, and we spend a lot of time thinking about impact and and what is the relationship between democracy and local news, because it's it feels like a truism, but I don't think everyone's thought all the way through it. So, part of how we think about it at the Trust is that there's kind of 3 components in my mind to this relationship between local democracy and local news. So one is exactly what you said, accountability, and that's accountability of powerful people and accountability of powerful institutions. And that is sort of like what you think of first. But I think there's two other dimensions, and this is what we see in our papers, like the papers that clearly have the support of their communities. One is the common good. So, really good community news reporting can help a community understand and get to a shared sense of what it means to have a common good for a certain geographic community, right? So common good is one, and then the other is a sense of civic identity. So I think and that has to do with like the connectedness that people feel to each other and to the place that they live. And a lot of the most sort of viral community news pieces are like the moose that like wandered into downtown yesterday, or like in our community it was like the bear that was like wandering around Wilson Farms for a week.
But verified wanderings.
Verified wanderings, yes, verified wanderings. And those stories are really important because it helps you connect to your neighbors, and it helps answer the question of like, where do I live and what happens here. So I think we have to put just as much weight, to your point, on the common good and on the kind of civic identity and connectedness as we do on accountability.
I'd add a third, if I might. Smaller papers, in particular, I spent a lot of time in California and then in other parts of the world. Some good smaller neighborhood or small town newspapers there's a don't tread on me function, particularly in the kind of country we live in that we heard about at lunch, the states as laboratories of autocracies, reaching in and limiting local control. Local papers can sort of say, stop messing with us, state, higher level, and can do that in quite compelling ways that connects them to the community. They're sort of the lobby as well. I want to ask kind of two, and I apologize for this, but I live in a breakaway region of this country, the increasingly independent Republic of California, and I spend as much time outside the U.S. as in. And I sort of wonder, I think of the local news as one thing to fix on, but you go to a lot of other places. I particularly see this in East Asia and Europe and in some parts of Latin America. And you go into municipalities, and they have all these people who are there to help you with public participation, to help you engage and connect. The best small city is Donostia San Sebastian in the Basque Country. We're in the old Franco prison. There are like 12 people in there, and they'll help you engage, and they're going to make sure the community doesn't miss something. I don't see that kind of civic infrastructure in this country. And the municipalities are where there's that kind of local level people helping you. And I wonder if local news media couldn't be part of that, but also, and the second part of this un-American question is, since that's a public function, since this is supposedly a democracy that we're saving, isn't that then something the government and the taxpayer should pay for, both a civic infrastructure that covers local media? Shouldn't the government be paying for this, like my Swiss colleague always tells me, like, I work for Swiss Broadcasting, and all our media is paid for by a ballot initiative that we passed to put a 400 Swiss francs, tax on every household in Switzerland. Why can't we? Why isn't that the path to fill this massive gap?
So there are at least two questions there. I'll start with the first one.
Yeah.
There's an important document that you all should check out called the Local News Roadmap. That was sponsored by the foundations I mentioned earlier, but it's not their official point of view. It's three very influential thinkers in our field, including Daryl Holliday, who runs the Midwest-based Documenters program, which trains citizens, ordinary citizens, non-professional journalists, to engage in journalistic activities by going to public meetings, taking notes, reporting back what they've seen and observed, and given the local news loss, it's a really promising program. They got a $10 million grant, really worth reading. The Local News Roadmap talks about moving away from a model of saving the news, by the way, I don't think it's a binary, to a model of like civic information ecosystems. In truth, I don't think it's either or, so I'm just going to state that personal opinion. Yeah. But it stirred a conversation, right? Because it's like during COVID, one of the innovations we had was a text-based hotline where people could ask us questions about COVID, and like we actually answered them in real time. And it like tens of thousands of subscribers. we do our most popular thing most election years is our voter guide, which is comprehensive. And last year, for the first time, was translated not only into Spanish, but Vietnamese and Tagalog. And that just explains who's running. What does the railroad commissioner actually do? Has nothing to do with railroads. They're energy regulator. They regulate oil and gas. And no, they're not changing the name for a specific reason. So explaining what is going on and also providing service journalism, right? Should journalists play a role, Joe, in helping you understand how to file for unemployment benefits, helping you understand, how to claim child support if there's a deadbeat parent, how to, and in America, I'm going to briefly, I'm not a comparative political scientist, but I would say there are many differences between us and Europe that are probably pretty obvious to everyone in this room. But I think in America, charities play a lot of that role, frankly, right? They'll help you apply for benefits, especially if you're in a minority community or language community. But you're right. I mean, look, in places that have more resources, there are certainly people who help facilitate engaging with government. That's a level of progressive, I hope we're there. I think this foundation is this whole conference is about kind of getting us to the baseline. But surely a thriving and flourishing democracy would have those things you're talking about, right? That would help facilitate nonpartisan, meaningful engagement with government. So I think that's a great decades out kind of goal to, strive for after, hopefully we've preserved the existing democratic rights we have.
I'll say that I have a deep desire for a public policy solution to this, and I have a deep suspicion about any possible federal level government intervention into news and information. I think it just opens up a can of worms. You can talk about
you please.
California. I think it opens up a can of worms because the first question becomes well, what is a newsroom? And oh, friends, if we have policymakers deciding what is a newsroom, it will not end well. So, I think I'm very skeptical at the federal level that we'll get to something meaningful.
Do you want to explain what's going on in California?
Go ahead.
Well, very briefly, so California and New Jersey have their legislatures set up statewide local news funds, basically. And in each case, there's basically an intermediary, either a university or some panel of experts that determine what is legitimate, fact-based, verified local news worthy of getting these grants from the state government. That's all I'll say. As Elizabeth says, it's highly controversial. Yes. And when people say, look, I've lived in Europe, BBC, there's great state-funded news. We actually have state-funded broadcaster Voice of America, but obviously by its mandate, it cannot broadcast with it. It's focused on, from the Cold War, focused on, democracy promotion worldwide. So there is that, would we really want a state-funded, federal broadcaster? That raises a lot under whose administration, under whose,
and I think
so that's a very profound topic, actually, yeah.
And I think we have an incredible system of public broadcasting in this country, but I think it's notable that our public broadcasting, the Public Broadcasting Act and our public broadcasting system is predominantly focused on education and culture. And I think that's really, really important. And there are a lot of stations that are getting into primary local news provision. And I think part of the reason why they can do that is because they have a diversified funding base, and actually quite a small percentage of their funds, as you said, come from federal support. I think it's really dicey in terms of federal policy intervention. I think there's a lot more interesting things happening at the state level. One huge sort of state level subsidy that makes a difference for our papers, the papers that we work in, is the public notices, which are towns and municipalities required to post things like dates of their annual meetings, like notices of big public financing. So that has a really interesting both kind of commercial, because it's technically kind of a form of advertising revenue, but also a kind of good government disclosure piece. But I will also say that for some of the communities that we are in where we have public notice revenue, there will definitely be municipal officials who call up the newsroom and say, I really didn't like the coverage that you did of the mayor's office. Are you really sure that you want to reapply for your public notice next year?
I largely agree with Elizabeth, though I would point there are a couple of proposals that do intrigue me, like the idea of a tax credit for subscribing to local news. Yeah. Although even there, anything can be abused, and probably will be.
But-
So we're seeing, just to be specific, there's like increasingly hyper-partisan so-called pink slime sites that masquerade as like the Peoria Independent. I'm making that up. And it's like, it looks like news, but in fact, it's all like hyper-partisan, like propaganda, basically.
Right.
So again, that definitional question of what is news, what is journalism, I'm very, very leery about us as journalists saying, oh, no, that's not journalism. Because that's, first of all, it's very arrogant. And secondly, I don't think journalism is like medicine. It is like medicine in the sense that we have standards and ethics for those of us who are professionals. But it's also not like medicine in that it's a craft. And someone who's like from a farming community should be able to go to their town council and write about it if they wish to. And that's engaging in journalistic activity if it's done in good faith.
I mean, but just to finish the circle, but do you have the skepticism or the nervousness, I mean, of a government funding regime versus the rich guy funding regime, the hedge fund regime, or philanthropic foundations. I work for a nonprofit that's funded by a lot of foundations, and they never try to meddle, never.
So, Joe, I may have the most extreme story here because I went from working for a billionaire
Right.
who owns the LA Times.
Right. We used to work.
It's really good heart.
Yeah.
To a 501c3,
Yeah.
like no step in between.
Yeah.
And I can basically say that there's no media ownership model
Right.
that is like free of problems and free of conflict, right? And in general, like the free press, and this goes back to the early republic, there's always going to be this competition between stuff we're doing for the public good and stuff we're doing for commerce, right?
Right.
And like, there's always been this element of like, is the news a commercial thing? Now, there is a theory now that says the business model is so broken and will never come back that basically philanthropy has to be the primary way of funding subnational news in America. I wouldn't go quite that far, but I can see more and more why that argument is prevalent. Because even working at the LA Times, which is one of the nation's great newspapers, but even helping it refocus its strategy primarily around California and Southern California, that was a struggle. And that's not because of bad owners, it's partly because of these legacy traditions. Many of these papers have so much legacy and tradition and frankly some baggage sometimes. But it's not like new organizations don't have baggage either.
Let me ask one more question to put you on the sort of the city side of the thing. One great thing the National Civic League did in its last selection of all-American cities, and some big cities, it reached down and designated as an all-American city the most democratic small town I've ever been in, Gonzales, California, which is Californians couldn't tell you where Gonzales is. You can drive through it in a minute and a half.
Where is it?
It's in Salinas Valley,
Right.
which is the lettuce and spinach part. It's which is part of Monterey County, which is a very long county. It's 20 minutes south of Salinas. You can drive through it in 90 minutes on the 101 and miss it, basically. It's 9,000 people. It's 92% Latino. It's farm workers. It's people working food processing. And it's magically governed in a democratic spirit. As a youth city council that actually writes laws, it wrote the city's, kids wrote the city's mental health plan during the pandemic.
Wow.
The list goes on of things it does. But it doesn't have a newspaper. It doesn't have a media entity. I mean, there's the Salinas Valley Tribune, which supposedly covers, Gonzales as well as the nearby communities of Soledad and Greenfield. But there's nothing in it. It's just basically a few announcements.
How do you find coverage of like the most important debates going on in the city?
You don't, not online. I mean, once in a while it makes some news in the Monterey County Herald, which is a weekly paper, will come down and write a story. And that's a weekly paper that sustains itself in part because the editor won the lottery. They come down and do something because Gonzales, is pretty clever in figuring out microgrids. It's got 100%. Vaccination for COVID, 100%. I mean, I think they sent 2 great-looking firefighters to get the last few holdouts. So, it's this kind of place. But, they meet a lot, they gather a lot, they talk a lot. It's small enough.
Yeah.
But they don't have a paper. And, and I asked them once if they thought they needed one. They didn't think they needed one, right? So, I mean, what is the paper supposed to do in the town or the neighborhood? I mean, what is
Well,
it?
if they meet a lot and talk a lot,
Yeah.
then...
Yeah, you don't need it.
most of the problem of democratic civic life at a small scale is people don't meet a lot and talk a lot.
Right,
So
right.
that's kind of like the problem
Right.
to solve.
Right, yeah. I mean, so we don't need this everywhere, right? If you're that good.
Well, I mean, if we had 350 million people living in a version of Gonzales, California,
yeah.
we wouldn't. But I think we all know that that's pretty far from the truth.
Yeah. So what at the local level? I'm curious. Like, I mean, you need someone to. We talked about there were three things we mentioned. You need someone to sort of narrate what's going on and tell you who died and who had a kid. You need someone to check on what the school system, the school board, and the city council are doing. Maybe what sort of businesses in town are doing. I always feel like Gonzales doesn't know enough about what the food processors are doing. Your Costco, vegetable trays come from there, or put together there. But I mean, what else? I mean, what is the expectation at that level that you should, if you're a citizen, that you should demand? If you're talking about citizenship.
So I think you can correct me on the details if I'm wrong, but I believe it was 2011 the FCC did a big study on the information needs of communities, and it came up with, I want to say it was like 9 core information needs that are like public safety, crime, weather. I don't know if traffic was on there, but the local development. So there are categories, and so when you want to assess kind of editorial quality or robustness, there's, from an information perspective, there's a rubric for saying from an information perspective, are people's quote unquote needs being met? But to the question about are people meeting and gathering and talking about those things, that's where I think there's a lot of really important innovative work to be done in small local newsrooms and big ones like yours, really leading the way for convening community conversations around issues that matter.
To be frank, there's also been, even since 2011, a move away from things like covering crime, weather, and traffic. They're important, but you can actually find that information elsewhere. And so it's we call it kind of commodity information. It doesn't mean it's not important. It's very important, but you can open up an app usually and see what the weather is. What I think local news organizations at their best can do, though, can really help chronicle the life of a community and give it some meaning and context. One reason I wanted to come to this conference, and one reason I'm in Texas, and by the way, I'm a native of New York City, which has its own sense of place, but I think that across America, and a lot of you come from across the nation, a sense of place is being lost. And it's being lost for a variety of reasons. Big box retail and Amazon, mom and pop stores closing, not enough investment in historic preservation, the things that kind of make the life of a community feel distinct and unique. And I don't know if that sounds too far afield because it's not directly democracy, but it's actually part of what enables social trust. Because if we don't have trust, I think it's going to be a hard road to get back to a robust society. And so I think at its best, local news can foster trust, but also, again, keeping in mind that accountability function, which is vital. One last thing I want to say is that most of you probably may have heard of this case in Kansas where there was a local publisher who I think was jailed. Or the office was raided. The office was raided. Then there was an Alabama publisher where she was jailed. And so this has come really home till I'm on the board of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And this is getting very, very real because there are people who say, oh, well, you published leaked information. Leaking it may be illegal. Publishing leaked information under the First Amendment is not. It's protected. But this is coming home to communities across America. It's not Pentagon Papers. In many ways, it's more insidious and more, it's happening. And so I would just really urge you all to also think about the First Amendment in your communities and who's standing up for it and who's defending it. Yeah.
Let's go to you, the audience, for questions. We have one microphone here with John.
Hi, thank you very much for this. Susan Haig with Civic Story. Elizabeth, I just wanted to say that in New Jersey, you probably know, there's the Corporation for New Jersey Local Media, and that was a very successful purchase of a family-owned, very reputable family-owned group of 14 weeklies, and so it's been very successful. It's really a nice model, and it was very deliberately bipartisan. The two founders were two different parties to show that it wasn't. So that's one thing. I just wanted to comment, Sewell, when you say it's just a tax status, I would say that, from a long career in the arts, that is mission driven, and that the great opportunity for nonprofit newsrooms is as change agents. They want to change something in society and their locale, and that makes them somewhat different from a commercial. So.
I'm being a bad boss because I'm addressing this audience and not like our staff. For sure, I did not mean that it's just a tax status.
But I have heard that by philanthropists, really
well.
And
I think that's an important part of it. But I also want to credit, though, because there's a whole generation of journalists who want to work at organizations like the ones we represent and are privileged to represent. And they don't want to work for big, giant corporations. Right. They don't want to work for either the New York Times Company or for Fox they want to stay local. They want to give back to their communities. There are journalism schools in your communities that are trying to train people who want to stay and invest in the places they're from. And so I want to be very, very clear that that is at its most noble, I think, a big sea change going on in journalism, where people are recognizing that making it to the big leagues or covering Congress, there's like 2,000 people doing it right now. Congress isn't doing that much. So is that really, if those 2,000 people were in your communities throughout America, covering local issues, what kind of impact would that have on our democracy? And I think thank you for pointing that out.
It's a dynamic in the nonprofit field, the INN, 440 members. It's really exciting. My question to the panel is the idea of local. If our national news spent a little time just affirming the need for citizens to engage locally. In New Jersey, there's national, there's state, there's county, there's local, and there's 550 municipalities. There are so many relationships that citizens need to handle. It is a big job. So I'm just wondering if the whole field, if a very broad field, could just begin to encourage the national broadcasters to recognize that democracy depends on engaged citizens locally. And they've always kind of looked at local as non-news. We've all heard that. So it would be interesting to see how that could happen, maybe just newsroom by newsroom.
Yeah, I agree. That would be totally fascinating.
Other questions?
Hi. First, I just wanted to comment. There's a real interest in the participatory democracy space in local news. I've been seeing it recently, in particular in the meshing of a lot of pro-democracy groups in localities and the creation of structures, and to say, well, it was interesting because you were talking about local ownership and what sort of structures on the ground could own it. So I just wanted to point that out and would love to chat further about that. But my question is, with the massive decline in trust in national media, has that led to an increase in readership or viewership in local, or if not, could it?
I'm so glad you asked that because we hadn't touched on that. As you know, Pew, Gallup, trust in the media is at an all-time low. I'm personally a little bit, well, first of all, trust in most institutions is at an all-time low right now. Trust in the Supreme Court ain't so hot lately. But I think, I take it seriously, though I also think that when you ask people what is the media, they're usually thinking about broadcast television that is political commentary, and that is a kind of media. I'm not disrespecting it, but it's one kind. Someone covering a city council meeting who's from the area, knows the context, knows the history, wants to cover events impartially, that person's a freaking civic treasure. And when I think people think of that person, they might know that person maybe, although less likely now with the demise of local news. That is what we should be rewarding as the media, right? So it is true that local news is generally more trusted than, national news. So there's something to work with there. I'm curious about how that can be built upon. And again, that gets to, I think, the profound question of What is the relationship between journalists? Let me describe the journalistic personality. We're very, very like leery and skeptical of everything, and hopefully that's not cynicism. But it's often like we're often not joiners. I'm not a great journalist because I love joining things. And often it's like we have to keep a hands-off, arm's-length distance from everything, whether it's the local food pantry or the local Republican Party. There are obviously good reasons why you need objectivity, impartiality, and to keep a kind of professional detachment. But, if you're not seeing that the local journalism institution is in fact a part of the community and has an interest in the community's public good, common good, broadly defined, then I don't think you're actually going to be able to build that trust. So I think it's like a fine balance, but it's a really important one.
And I would say that, trust in local media, I don't remember the last Pew study, maybe you do, I want to say it wasn't as low as national media, but it was still, relatively high. I want to say it was like maybe
Teens, 20s, something like that.
No. I want to say it was like 40 maybe.
Oh, was that high?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which, when you're comparing very small numbers is not terrible. But
Better than Congress.
Better than Congress, yeah. But I think the key to getting people back into the local news habit is also writing about things that people care about and delivering it to them in a format that they want to read it in. So a lot of the work we do with our very small newsrooms is around like community listening. What are the issues that matter in your community? So like in Colorado, we did a whole bunch of community listening sessions around the town of Littleton. And among other things, one of the most important topics that came up was affordable housing. So then the newsroom spent like 6 months doing a whole fantastic series on affordable housing focused on that community because that's what it heard that was on people's minds. But back to your sort of what are the journalistic biases, I think one of the unfortunate journalistic biases, national and local, is like, I know the important issues when I see them, and I'm gonna just come up with the issues that matter as opposed to actually understanding what's important in a community right now and how to be responsive to that. So on the kind of like practice, innovation, evolution side of things, that's where things have to change. I think that will bring people back, and it is bringing people back.
Last question. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much for this really rich conversation. My name is Abby Kaplan. I'm with iCivics. I'm a proud daughter of journalists, so I've really just appreciated this breakout. But we primarily operate in the K-12 space, so I'm coming to this with kind of a young readership or young audience hat on. So you touched on kind of the intersection or sometimes lack of intersection between the democracy space and the journalism space. I came to the democracy space because of my family background in journalism. If you could answer, what resources are newspaper publishers or newspapers willing to devote to strengthening democracy and enriching the ties between communities and schools with newspapers?
Unfortunately, because of the economics, I'm afraid there are probably not that many publishers thinking about that, unfortunately. I do want to give a lot of props to the News Literacy Project and the National Association, I think I'm getting it right, or National Alliance for Media Literacy Education, NAMLI. They're both doing tremendous work in K-12. Now, Alan Miller, who's the founder of News Literacy Project, so it started off as K through 12, and it was talking about information literacy, but of course that's related to civic literacy. And I'm so glad you raised that, because one of the big fears I have is beyond journalism. I'm worried that we're entering a period of information apocalypse, what the RAND Corporation calls truth decay. And if I talk to many people in other spaces who have nothing to do with news, but it has to do with reliable information, doctors, scientists. They are terrified about the erosion of trust in expertise or authority. The notion, it's fine to do your own research if it's research involving primary and secondary sources. If doing my research is watching a YouTube video that Uncle Joe sent me that's full of weird conspiracies, that's not really research. So I don't want to bring it too off topic, but I think that ultimately News Literacy Project matters, and Alan Miller, can you believe this? They started with K-12. Their next kind of target population is actually older news consumers. Because unfortunately, a lot of our seniors, and we've seen this probably in all of our families, the internet came up on them so fast. And I am actually very sympathetic to that. and all of a sudden, everything seemed equivalent. A major New York Times investigation, a congressman's tweet. It all looks the same. There's no hierarchy of information anymore. It's all flying at you. Who wouldn't be really confused? And so we're actually seeing that Alan is focusing actually on helping older news consumers become more discerning about their information. That does not mean, oh, you should only read the New York Times. I would never say that. You should read a lot of different things, first of all. But secondly, most of all, you should be discerning and discriminating about what it is you read. You should click on that About page. Who owns this? Who works here? Who funds this? Like, what are their interests? Are there clear biographies? The Trust Project is a Google News Initiative-backed project that we're part of, that it tries to assign indicators of trust to more credible news sources that abide by these basic principles. But sadly, there's a lot of so-called publications that don't.
And I would just say, on the resources question, I think one of the truly saddest pieces of, my kind of entrepreneurial journey into community journalism is that, so many of these newsrooms are totally under-resourced. We acquire papers with reporters who are on food stamps and have to take multiple other jobs in order to do what they do. And so in that kind of a context, it's really hard to ask someone to do more than, please write your stories for the week. So, my hope is that in this wave of trying to figure out what is the next set of resources we can bring into this field, that it can also then encourage that kind of expansiveness of the mission.
Just to close, I love the question, and I would want to say one thing, that I think a big institutional failure across American media is we have, I think, misinformed people about what democracy is. There are a lot of democracy editors out there and things that, are saving democracy. I hear that in this town, democracy dies in darkness, which I've never quite understood what they meant by that. Is there a lighting problem here in the city?
But that was Bezos. That was from Bezos, not the journalist.
Yeah, that was from Bezos. Yeah, but there is a sense that we're saving democracy means we're saving an American kind of presidential system, and that our way of doing politics. And that way of doing politics is pretty ugly. And I have a different life outside of journalism as a coach, and spend a lot of time with lots of different kids, and they're reading that as, it's pretty much a cesspool. So they associate that with democracy. And then you see this polling, not just in this country, but others, where younger people have very low opinions of democratic systems. I think it's much better. The one thing I wish I could tell everyone is that, democracy should be thought of as 4 beautiful words: everyday people governing themselves. It really is the sort of thing you do with other people. That's the spectrum on which we should understand it, we should judge it, we should attempt to measure that. And I think that's, the one passing recommendation, the best journalist on this subject ever, and I rip him off everyone, was a guy. He had a career, something else, famous for something else, but his name was Gandhi. And he pumped out, it's really embarrassing. I struggle to get one column out a week. This guy was leading a national liberation movement. He's doing 2 or 3. But the columns are great when you go read collections of his columns. They're almost always about the panchayat, the village democracy. They're funny. They're very specific about how people saw problems. And it is that sort of, in that kind of spirit that I think that sort of understanding it's a work. Democracy is work. It's something we do with our neighbors. Is how we have to reimagine that.
It's like a way of life, not just not an endpoint that we're going to suddenly get there and it'll all be good.
Yeah, and I just wish also my profession and I personally was better at telling those kind of stories in more often and in a more compelling way. At least as good as Gandhi did it.
All right.
Thank you. I think we're done.
Thank you. This is great.
I can't believe you.